Greetings, everyone, on this Epiphany Sunday here as we join together for our English Bible study at St. Matthew's Church. We're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew today. We've been off for a couple weeks with the holidays, but if you remember where we were, we had been in Matthew chapter 1, taking a break from our study of Mark. In Mark, we're right up to Holy Week, so we're holding that off for another week, couple weeks. But we're going back to Matthew today, to Matthew chapter 2 for the Epiphany story, which many of you probably heard as the gospel reading today in different churches, or if you watched St. Matthew's online. So I'd invite you all now to turn to Matthew chapter 2. We've heard Matthew's brief story of Jesus' birth, not nearly as extensive as Luke, but now this is kind of chapter 2, which is probably a little bit later, maybe a year or two after Jesus' birth. And why don't we start then with Carolyn up in the corner, on my screen at least. Carolyn, if you'd read Matthew chapter 2, verse 1.
Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying...
So Jesus is born, it says, there was a Bethlehem in Galilee also, which is near Nazareth. So Matthew's very clear for us that this is Bethlehem in Judea. Anybody know what Bethlehem means?
Basket of bread.
Means the house of bread. Yeah, the house of bread. And it was known as the city of David. Why?
David came from there.
David was from there. He'd been born there. He was anointed by Samuel to be king there. And think of that line. There's two different streams of thought there almost. So this is Jesus being born in the city of David. Matthew's making clear for us that Jesus is now the successor to David's throne, but also the house of bread. What do you think is symbolized or being foreshadowed there about Jesus' ministry?
His crucifixion.
Certainly. Lamb of God.
He feeds us,
Feeds us. I am the
Bread of life.
bread of life, right. All that symbolism is being worked right in already at this little verse. It says that it's in the days when Herod was king. This is the only dating that Matthew gives. Luke tries to be a little more specific, and it gets a little confusing with history. Josephus tells us that Herod died in 4 BC. So that tells us that the birth of Jesus, as Matthew understands it, is probably somewhere between 6 to 4 BC. Our calendars are a little bit off there, but it's in this little period slightly before this time. Wise men came from the east. They're in Persia, in modern day Iran. There were a priestly caste called the
Pharisees.
No, this is in Persia. We often use the word instead of wise men or kings, we say the Magi, right, Magi. Daniel was a Magi, if you remember the Old Testament story of Daniel serving in the court. Magi is where we get our word magician from. Babylon was the home of astrology. All the other traditions, at least they understood astrology and mixed it with what we might consider astronomy today. They didn't really see a distinction between the two. All of the other stuff that we think of, Casper, Belchior, all of that stuff, the 3 kings, all of that is really tradition. 3 kings is probably because, what does that tradition come from?
Gifts.
3 gifts.
There's 3 gifts, so there's probably, that's how this tradition evolves. We know that there's a very early legend about the 3 kings, and their skulls are preserved as relics. And anybody know where those skulls are today? The skulls are in a chest at the cathedral in Cologne, Germany. When you stop off the train, the main train station is in a court. The cathedral's right there. And what are the supposed skulls of the 3 kings are in a chest there. It says that they're coming from the east, which means the rising of the sun. Now, there's also a tradition that this idea of Caspar, Balthazar, and Melchior kind of represent Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That it was a symbolic way of talking about them. Who were Shem, Ham, and Japheth?
Noah's sons.
Noah's sons. Okay, so by calling Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar kind of representative of those 3, What is that tradition trying to say?
3, triune God.
That's a good.
Prophecy from the Old Testament.
If you, taking the Noah story as it's written for the moment, 3 sons, all the Earth's population has been destroyed. So now you've got 3 sons who are going to be now the forebears of the entire world population. So connecting Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar to them is a symbolic way of saying that it's people from all over the world. Now, as with Noah, the whole world's population is now once again dispersed. Now the whole world comes back to worship the King, the newborn King of the Jews. Lots of symbolism wrapped up just in that one little verse. Judy, verse 2, please.
Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him.
Now, some people confuse that and they're like, well, they go west, don't they? How do they follow the star in the east? What it means there is we were in the east when we saw the star. We were in Persia, most likely, in Iran, most likely when we saw it. And now that's when we received this sign and we've been following it. It is most likely that the reason for all of this is, as I said, the Magi were skilled astronomers and they connected astronomy with astrology, seeing signs in the heavens for these different things they were studying. But also Daniel having been a Magi and the Jews having spent 70 years in captivity there in Babylon. During that time, those who were the educated of Babylon, who were the Magi's, would have become familiar with the Jewish scriptures. Perhaps they even had some copies of some ancient texts. But they knew these basic stories, and so these Magi apparently had put the two together, their own understandings coming out of Zoroastrianism primarily, and then coming with these new Jewish ideas that had been brought in a few hundred years before. They're combining these ideas to come up with this idea of the birth of the king. Cicero had talked about there being a great star, a constellation of stars, when Alexander the Great was born. This was something that was seen as a sign of a great king being born, going all the way back to Alexander. We call him Alexander the Great. What do anybody know what the Iranians call him?
King?
Alexander the Terrible or Alexander the Destroyer. We look at him from the Western perspective of this great guy who conquers. In the East, he's seen very much differently. So when Cicero used this quote about the signs in the heavens foretelling, he was speaking as a Westerner, seeing the rise of Alexander to be great. But the Magi would have seen it in very different terms. The Magi see the stars being aligned for Alexander's birth as portending evil. So for them to see in Jesus, in this alignment of stars, something good happening, that was probably due to the influence of the Jewish scriptures, which they had some familiarity with. Okay. Now, if you were a foreigner who was going to come and see the newborn king, where would you expect him to be?
Palace.
At the palace. And whose child would he be expected to be?
Herod.
You would expect him to be the king's son, but that's not what was happening. And so we're going to get into an explanation of that in verse 3. Why don't we drop down to Pam?
When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him.
Disturbed. What other translations do you have?
Troubled.
Troubled? Worried? Perturbed? Worried. Herod's clearly not happy. This is a little bit of background of where Herod is at this point. So Herod is written multiple wills, naming multiple different people as successor. He's constantly fearing for losing his throne. By the point that this happens, somewhere 6-5 BC, he's already put to death 2 of his sons from his first wife, Mariamne. Those sons were Aristobulus and Alexander. He's put to death his wife, Mariamne. He's put to death another son, Antipater, who was once named his heir, and he's also killed the brother and the mother of Mariamne. as well as her grandfather. That's all the people that Herod has already bumped off, thinking that they may in some way be a threat to his throne. Can you imagine when he gets this news that these kings have seen this sign from another land and have come here, and there's a newborn king in the land and he's not your son? You can imagine that Herod is disturbed. And of course, Jerusalem's disturbed because, as the old line is, when mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, right? If Herod's upset, that's a bloodthirsty upset. That's why the whole city, which of course is hyperbole here, not everybody knows what's going on, but it's saying the leadership and the people who are hearing these stories are very concerned. What's Herod heard? Is there a usurper to the throne? And what is Herod going to do about this?
So, Pastor, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but by a few verses, but that puts the slaughter of the innocents into a totally understandable perspective because they ain't even family.
Absolutely. And that's actually not going to be in Matthew. That's going to be from Luke. So you're not getting ahead of us. You're bringing in another text there. That's good,
Right.
Mike.
Story-wise.
It absolutely makes perfect sense. Herod has already bloodthirstily killed off all kinds of people. Some scholars raise the issue with the slaughter of the innocents that Josephus makes no mention of it. That's true, he doesn't. But Herod killed so many people so many times, certainly Josephus hasn't recorded all of them. Part of the problem is that there's an ancient crypt in Bethlehem where there's many, many, many skeletons. And tradition has said, well, that's from the slaughter of the innocents. Well, that's nonsense. Bethlehem simply wasn't that big. A little village at that time might have had a dozen or so kids of that age at that point. Would have been very easy for Josephus not to think that that's an important story to tell, because it was just daily life under Herod.
We tend to think it's a lot. Just a slaughter everywhere.
That's because that's how we picture it, and especially that image has been reaffirmed because of that ancient crypt, which clearly has nothing to do with the slaughter of the innocents. But then that story gets built into Christianity early on,
Right.
when just math and birth rates and things would tell us that wouldn't have been possible. But
We
certainly
don't know the census. Like, what was the census in Bethlehem?
we don't know how many people were there, so we can't. Yeah, obviously the guess of a dozen to 20 is historians trying to guess from the number of people that we knew were there at the time.
Thank you.
Jean, verse 4, please.
And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born.
Now this sounds like Herod's tied in with the priests, and he consults them and honors them and has a high view of them. Not so much. They hated him, he hated them. He actually began his reign by slaughtering the Sanhedrin. He killed all the chief priests when he became king. So these are all people largely that he has put in as puppets anyway. That had happened about 30 years before this. This was just life under Herod. If you got on Herod's bad side, you were dead. And we'll see another example of that. We'll talk in a few minutes. Verse 5, Terry, please.
They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet.
And why don't we go right in? Julie, would you read verse 6, please?
Yes, O little town of Bethlehem, you are not just an unimportant Judean village, for a governor shall rise from you to rule my people Israel.
This is not really a direct quote from anywhere. Matthew's doing a little creativity here. He's kind of bringing in different ideas of this idea, trying to weave together some Old Testament scriptures. But they see Bethlehem as the most likely place for the birth of the Messiah because who had come from there?
David.
Because this was where David had come from, and so the new David was going to come from there. Remember, Herod also is not a real Jew. He's an Idumean. His father tried to marry into the tribe, so Herod is suspect anyway. He doesn't have proper credentials. He certainly cannot claim to be a descendant of David. So if we now have somebody being born in Bethlehem, now what we had already heard about Herod's upset when he hears Bethlehem, now he's even more worried because now he's hearing this could be somebody coming from that royal bloodline. The authorized tradition, the King James there says he shall rule. Different translations say different things. The proper word there is he will shepherd. Homer had called the kings the shepherds of the people. We talk about shepherd leadership, that type of truly caring for the people, caring for the sheep. That's what Matthew is getting at here, that this would be a king who would truly care for the people. Now, think of that in terms of the popular or public reaction to that. Herod knows everybody hates him. They only fear him. Now, you can rule with fear for a while, but then to think that there's a usurper to the throne, he's coming from the right city that could be David's bloodline, and this could be somebody who's actually going to care for the people. Who are the people going to tend to side with? Dalton, verse 7, please.
My last verse says, ruler to be the shepherd.
Ruler to be
So
the shepherd.
verse 7, then Herod summoned the astrologers to meet him secretly and ascertain from them the exact time when the star had appeared.
So this is interesting. He gets this word from his counselors, from the Sanhedrin, from the religious leadership, the ones that he's largely put into place after slaughtering them. But now when he makes this, we hear he does this secretly. So he doesn't tell the religious leaders what he's up to now. Instead, he privately calls the Magi back in and sees what they're up to and tries to find out what more they might know time-wise. Verse 8, Karen, please.
He told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, let me know. I want to go and worship him too.
Well, of course, he doesn't want to go and worship him, and we know what he really wants to do. We might call that this is reconnaissance. He's sending them off on reconnaissance, but he's lying to them to try to get them to do his bidding. He wants every detail. He wants to find out whatever he could because he's already brewing in his mind what he's going to do about it. Carol, verse 9, please.
When they had heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was.
We won't get into today all the different theories of what the star might be. Different things have been postulated over time, from asteroids to comets, but we don't have any evidence that anything lines up time-wise. One of the most common is that we're talking about constellations moving and Aries being conjoined with it has to do with Jupiter and Aries lining up somehow. All of these are possible interpretations, but we don't know for sure. But somehow they see, by connecting their astronomy, astrology with what they know of the Jewish texts, they get this idea that that's where it's going to be. And so they head off. And verse 10 says, Mike?
The sight of the star filled them with delight.
Oh.
And going into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary.
It's verse 11. Nice.
That's
no,
okay.
sorry.
Go ahead and read it, Mike.
You know, Jerusalem has little dots, so it's hard to keep. And going into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. And falling to their knees, they did him homage. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh.
So they're filled with joy. The word is megalon. It's overwhelming, exceeding, huge amounts of joy. They're truly excited. They reach the house, it says. This isn't a stable. We're not here at this isn't Luke's story of the night of. This is sometime later. They reach the house where the child, and the word there is more for an infant, not a baby, so some time has transpired since the birth. The child is there with the mother, and they bow down and worship him with the different gifts. They open their treasures. Does anybody have something besides treasures?
Presents, mine says.
Presents, okay.
Gifts.
Gifts. Treasures, the word is thesaurus. They open their thesaurus. Why does that make sense?
Thesaurus is words.
Words.
It is a treasury of words. That's literally what a thesaurus is. It's a treasury of words. So you look in this treasure to find words when you're trying to write something. You want more than one different expression. That's what it means, a treasury of words, and that's where it comes from. So they open their treasures here, which can also be caskets. The word can also be used for caskets, and you think of the treasures inside of a casket, the way ancient burial practices were. It's related to the word for tithe. It's also related to the word treasury. They open these things and they present him with three different gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold was considered a gift for royalty. Frankincense was considered a gift for deity, for a god, and myrrh was a spice which was used to anoint a body for burial. Most scholars think that it's those who accept the story here would say that it's probably these gifts then which finance the trip to Egypt, which is going to come up in the next verse. And we're at, Sandra, do you want to read today, verse 12?
And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
The word for warned there is the word for transact business. This is the word that is often used for somebody who goes to consult an oracle, that they're trying to base their business decisions on. I suppose it'd be today in Eastern culture, still some people will go to a fortune teller to want to know whether or not to do the right thing business-wise. Of course, we would say that's not right and we would poo-poo it, but that's the word that's used here. This dream is kind of like this warning from an oracle telling them, don't go back to Herod, return in a different direction. Mike, how does yours translate that? That could be interesting.
I just have warned in a dream.
Warned in a dream. Okay, didn't go very far with that. All right. The word literally can be translated as it's an answer that you receive in your sleep. An answer you receive in your sleep. Verse 13, are we at, Scott?
Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him.
So Joseph had already had a dream earlier. If you remember chapter 1, it's okay to take Mary as your wife. The child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. Now the Magi have this dream vision which tells them don't go back to Herod. And now we have a third where Joseph hears, get up, take the child, and escape. This is a vision now of how God is going to protect this child through Joseph. Gladys, verse 14, please.
And he arose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed for Egypt. Yeah, it was there.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess that's it.
Okay, in verse 15, why don't you go ahead and read, Melissa?
And remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son.
Now that quote is actually not from the Hebrew Bible. It's not from the Old Testament. Scholars think that it's quite possible that like in the early days of Christianity, before the scriptures are compiled, there were things that were just quotes that people knew, had memorized, had remembered, that the stories were told of things Jesus had said. This is probably from that, we call it a testimony or a testimonia, probably one of those things which was just part of Jewish culture at this time, that the prophet had said, out of Egypt I would call my son. So Matthew goes and he quotes that. Why he does that when it's not a clear scriptural reference, we can't be sure, but there is one school of thought, at least, which says that it's in response to a Jewish tradition which is evolving by the time that Matthew writes. Does anybody know what the Talmud is? Melissa, you can't answer.
The prophets, writing of the prophets.
Books of law. The Hebrew Bible.
The Torah is the first 5 books, and then we think of the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament. The Talmud and Mishnah are different collected sayings from rabbis over time.
Oh.
So a Talmud citation arises, and the Talmud quote is basically that when Jesus comes back from Egypt, he has a scar on his body which contains magic arts. It was a way to try to paint Jesus as somehow coming back from Egypt, having been part of the Egyptian cult and being somehow evil. So it's quite possible that that tradition was already arising as an attack against Jesus. And so Matthew puts this in here to be very clear that it's God's will that Jesus came from Egypt. Jesus doesn't go down to Egypt to become a sorcerer or a magician. Jesus is sent there by God, and God brings him back now to be the Messiah. It was not unusual for Jews to travel to Egypt at that time. There were many colonies of Jews living there, and it was free flowing kind of back and forth, visiting different Jewish communities in that area. Verse 16, are we down to Daniel? Mr. Acolyte, please.
Harold realized that the wise men had tricked him, so he became very angry. He gave orders concerning him and the area around it. All the boys 2 years old and under were to be killed. This agreed with the time when the wise men had seen the star.
Thank you, Daniel. So Herod's already worried this guy's from the right city. He's probably going to be popular as a shepherd. And now the wise men lied to me. Herod's rage is just building and building. Of all the different portrayals on screen, the one I've always say I love the best is Peter Ustinov as Herod. And he's standing there at his temple or in his palace, and he's just screaming and screaming at the top of his lungs. And you can imagine big Peter Ustinov being this. At this point, we know Herod has a fatal disease. We don't know for sure what it is, but he's dying. He's probably not of right mind anyway, and his right mind wasn't a good one to begin with. He's in this rage, he's screaming, and now he's even more angry, and so now he gives the order, go and kill all the boys under 2. And here's the prophecy which Matthew brings to mind. Back to Carolyn, why don't you read 17 and 18, please?
Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more.
That's a quote from Jeremiah. It really relates to the return from Babylon, the return at the end of the Babylonian captivity, that there's going to be restoration. I was going to read you the whole quote from Jeremiah, but we don't really have time there. But it's a reference back to there. Ramah is a city there in that area of Palestine. Rachel was who? Somebody's Jacob's wife, and she was buried near Bethlehem. So that's the connection Matthew makes there, is she had that her descendants had seen their country destroyed, and now it was going to be reestablished, but through this pain and agony. Verse 19, Judy, please.
But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying.
And here again, now we have another dream. Verse 20, Pam, please.
And said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead.
This is kind of hearkening back to Exodus, the story of Moses' birth. Now the person who is to be worried about, that person's dead. You can go home. Verse 21, Jean, please.
Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel.
And Terry, why don't you go and read 22, please?
But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee.
So he gets this message that the all clear, you might think that Herod's dead, but then you hear that Archelaus is ruling anyway. Archelaus was so awful that he only ends up being able to rule a few years because he gets thrown out by the Romans. That's what leads to the governor system, which will eventually bring us to Pontius Pilate. The Romans trusted Herod. They did not trust Herod's sons. So Herod tried to divide up his kingdom amongst them so none of them would seem too powerful to give threats to the Romans. Augustus at this point says, it's better to be Herod's sow than Herod's son, because Herod's sow will live longer. That comes from the emperor. So to try and do this, you can imagine that Joseph knows Archelaus is going to be even worse probably. So instead of going back there, they head to Galilee, and Archelaus will be gone in 9 years. Archelaus begins his reign. His father had begun by slaughtering the Sanhedrin. Archelaus begins in Jerusalem by killing the 3,000 most influential people in the city. Think of killing 3,000 people to start your reign. Verse 23, Julie, please.
23, okay. So they went to Galilee instead and lived in Nazareth. This fulfilled the prediction of the prophets concerning the Messiah. He shall be called a Nazarene.
And what exactly Matthew means there, scholars still debate. We're not exactly sure what this quote is. It could be a reference to Nazareth, which the root of that word is that it's a shoot or branch, that Jesus is now going to be from the branch of Jesse, but we're not exactly sure what Matthew's trying to say there. That's the Epiphany story. You probably noticed I had to check my phone because just as we're starting Bible study, I get a message that there's a water leak and I have to move my car because the basement is flooding. So we're going to close quickly with the Lord's Prayer, and I'm going to let you go.
I have a quick question, Pastor.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, up in verse, if I heard you correctly, did you say up in verse 15 there was no biblical reference for that quote, I called my son out of Egypt?
That's where it's not a direct quote. We think it's from, do you have a citation there on 15?
Yeah, I've got a citation, Hosea 11:1.
Okay, I have that citation too, and let me see why that's not considered direct quote.
Yeah. I can read it or you can.
I'll have it in just a second. Called him out of Egypt as my son. So what is the debate on that? I'm not sure, because that does seem like he's quoting Hosea pretty clearly. But
Yeah, in fact, I have called my son out of Egypt, which my two verses are the same phrasing.